Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on sexuality. In many countries such as Australia, there is a tendency for people to conflate the term sex, gender, and sexuality. As discussed in the previous lectures, the term sex refers to the biological aspects of the body, whereas the term gender refers to social aspects. And here we're going to discuss sexuality, which is the expression of one's attraction and desire, and is often independent of one's or another's sex and gender. Van Cryken refers to sexuality as sexual practices associated with sex and gender, which are then understood in terms of categories such as homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, or queer sexuality. Connolly refers to it as a person's capacity for sexual feelings. Once we understand one's sexuality, one can then describe that sexuality using terms which are broadly referred to as sexual orientation. Giddens and Sutton refers to sexual orientation as the direction of a person's sexual or romantic attraction. This is the result of a complex interplay of biological, and social factors. Connolly refers to sexual orientation as a person's physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction to a particular sex, male or female. So what these definitions help us understand is that one's sexual orientation can be seen as an identity that one takes on and uses to engage in social interactions and institutions such as family and friendships. For example, if someone's sexual orientation is gay, then he may engage in the world as a gay man. Yet one's sexuality, that is one's desires, do not necessarily lead to a corresponding sexual orientation. So just because a man has sexual relations or sexual attractions and desires towards men doesn't mean he identifies as gay. He may choose to identify as straight but have sex with men. So in countries like Australia, we struggle to understand how there can be a distance between sexuality and sexual orientation. So one way of looking at this is sexual orientation is really about those desires, how one is attracted to other people. And sexual orientation can be seen as the way in which that attraction is presented to the social world around us, how one uses sexuality to address their social selves, to be social in the world. So then the two don't necessarily always go together. So the struggle that we have with making that distinction is largely due to heteronormativity and heterosexism. So I'm going to firstly talk about this term heteronormativity. So this term heteronormativity is used to describe the ways in which heterosexuality is now perceived as the dominant form of sexuality. United States of American Michael Warner popularized the term in 1991. Underlying heteronormativity is an assumption that everyone is straight. This assumption exists within wider society and its social structures, such as in the family, media, education, politics. Moreover, it is not just an assumption that everyone is straight. Excuse me, I had to turn the mic off while I sneezed. So the assumption isn't that just that everyone is straight, but everyone is straight unless they are marked as other. Society only considers people to be queer if they are designated in some stereotypical way to be queer. We can see this really played out in terms of popular culture. Many film and TV characters or students in our classrooms, passengers in the bus, members of our families are all assumed to be straight until they are outed. And I've pictured here a few well-known famous people. So Ricky Martin, Rebel Wilson, and Elton John, all perceived to be straight. and certainly in the early parts of their career. And no one really, well, I won't say no one. Ricky Martin always had me suspect ever since I first saw him in the 1990s. But there is this assumption that these people are straight until they're being outed as queer. Within the broader concept of heteronormativity is the term heterosexism. Heterosexism was first published in 1971 by gay rights activist Craig Dodwell. Scott and Marshall see heterosexism as a diverse set of social practices, from linguistic to the physical, in the public sphere and the private sphere, covert and overt, in an array of social arenas in which the binary distinction of homosexual versus heterosexual is at work in such a way that heterosexuality is privileged. Macionis and Plummer refer to it as ideas organized around sexism and heterosexuality as dominant forms of sexual relations. More specifically, the term heterosexism addresses the inherent discrimination and prejudice which exists throughout society, while heteronormativity applies to the assumption that everyone is straight. Heterosexism draws attention to the way in which our social institutions, our social systems, our relationships are inherently discriminatory and prejudiced when it comes to sexuality. And this is quite obvious. Despite decades of changes to laws and social attitudes, in many parts of countries like Australia, there remains very significant and at times life-threatening bigotry against people who are not straight. It's quite ironic that students of this university and students who have done this unit have used the opportunity to provide feedback. You know, when students at the end of semester, you'll be provided the opportunity to provide feedback on this unit. Students actually have said that I shouldn't be teaching them about sexuality because it goes against their religion. And I see this as a form of heterosexism, this prejudice, and somehow that this attitude, which I find really fascinating, that just because it goes against their belief systems, their religion, somehow that's information that should be kept from them. So heterosexism draws attention to the systemic notion of prejudice, despite the fact that there have been decades of changes to laws and social attitudes. Last slide. So sexuality refers to the manner in which we are attracted to and desire others. This is distinct from one's sexual orientation, which is the outward expression of an identity, which may or may not be associated with one's sexuality. Just because one is sexually attracted to men and has sex with men doesn't necessarily mean, just because a man is attracted to men or has sex with men doesn't automatically mean that his sexual orientation is gay, because sexual orientation refers to an identity. Some people prefer to prioritize their primary relationships, their primary identities as being straight, heterosexual, and continue to have sexual relationships with men. And this can be a very problematic concept for a lot of people, to make that distinction between sexuality, sexual desires, and a sexual orientation or an identity. Most cultures assume and continue to assume that everyone is straight unless they're marked as clearly as other. Also, most cultures, despite passing of laws, etc., continue to discriminate against people for sexualities and sexual orientations that are not straight. A few key terms and 2 key authors for this topic. Thanks, everyone.